Great. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in person in DC, and for those of you joining online. I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President, Executive Editor at Devex, and we are delighted to be hosting this event today in partnership with CGIAR and IFPRI. Thank you for hosting us in this beautiful space. We're going to have a conversation about a topic that often doesn't get enough attention, and that's nutrition as an important aspect of health, food systems, food security, and sustainability. We have a really excellent lineup of speakers here today that we're really excited about. Down the street, there's the World Bank and IMF spring meetings happening. And so we wanted to bring this conversation here as part of that overall discussion around how we're able to move the needle on all the many complex global challenges we're facing post-pandemic, conflict, crisis, and how nutrition is an important factor in all of that. We have a pretty packed agenda, so I want to get started really quickly here. And I'm delighted to introduce Henrietta Fore, who pretty much is probably known to all of you, former head of UNICEF, USAID, and a real leader in the global development space. So thank you so much for joining us today. And then we also have joining us online, Purnima Menon, who's the Senior Director for Food and Nutrition Policy at IFPRI and CGIAR. So Purnima, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Welcome to IFPRI, I should say.
Oh, great. We see you. Well, thank you so much. So I want to start with you, Purnima, and there's 3.1 billion people in the world. That's 42% of the population that does not have access to healthy diets. Could you help to set the stage for us about what are the most concerning aspects of that, and what are the ramifications of such a startling statistic like that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. And firstly, thank you to Devex and to the CG. And I'm so sorry not to be there in person, but let me welcome all of you to IFPRI as well. So let's start with malnutrition as a challenge itself before we get to the topic of the unaffordability of diets. I think today we understand the extent to which malnutrition and the public health challenges related to this are just such a massive global challenge that affect billions around the world. So Henrietta knows this as well as anyone else, and I'm sure you'll speak to it. 150 million children almost are stunted around the world. About 45 to 50 million children are wasted. Nearly 400 million adults are underweight, but the counterpoint or the balance to that is that nearly 2.5 billion adults are overweight. Now, what do diets have to do with this? Everything. Right? One of the things that we've learned through many years of research now is that the quality of the diets that human beings consume is related to almost every form of malnutrition. The implications of that level of malnutrition that we're seeing around the world are profound. We know that a majority of children today who are dying around the world would not die if they weren't malnourished. We know that the levels of malnutrition and overweight and obesity that we're seeing are fueling non-communicable health diseases and the related health costs of that, which carry burdens both to society and to governments. But for us in the CGIAR, I think the focusing point of all of that is what's happening with the contribution of the quality of diets to all of these forms of malnutrition. And it's here that I think we come to really be concerned about the 3 billion people who can't afford healthy diets. This is what the numbers are suggesting, and it's really a big point around which our research is coming in to focus on. So I think mind-boggling as these numbers are for us, they highlight the urgent need to make healthy foods both more available and more affordable, the urgent need to work on the underlying drivers such as poverty, poorly functioning markets, gender and social inclusion challenges that create these challenges of unaffordability as well. And we'll speak a little bit more about that as we go along. But let me stop there and hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you. And you talk about some of the knock-on effects of this. And Henrietta, you've had a long career leading in global development, mentioned UNICEF, USAID. How do you see nutrition being intertwined with other development outcomes?
Well, nutrition is foundational. It is something that makes everything in life better. So to Purnima's very good points, bones and brains grow stronger in children, and you can be more alert in school, and all the things that we know. You feel emotionally more secure. So nutrition it's very foundational, and it's something that we as a community have to get across to everyone who's at the World Bank Spring meetings.
I like that little plug there. Well, Purnima, you mentioned a little bit about some of the research you do, and investments in agricultural research are extremely low, particularly in low and middle income countries. Can you talk a little bit about this funding gap and what specific types of research you think would yield more significant impact?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So, I think when typically the gaps in funding research are well known, right? So let me not talk about that as much in terms of numbers, but in terms of the types of research. So when you think about agricultural research, and you just close your eyes for a moment, I think most people think about research on the types of food that's being produced. What we feel is really important to look at is the kind of research that's going to help us understand the demand side possibilities for the transformation of food systems. And so by this, I mean research on, what's on people's plates? What are they actually eating? Where is that food coming from? What does it cost them? What are the inequalities around it? What do their food environments look like? What do markets look like? And often the topics related to consumers, food environments, markets, really what's on people's plates is not prioritized when you think about agricultural research. It is prioritized within the CGIAR, and I'm very proud of that. It is prioritized within IFPRI, and we're thrilled to be able to contribute to that. But we live in a world today where we know that consumer choices are going to have tremendous impacts on what people on people's well-being. They're also going to have tremendous impacts on how food systems transform. So we know there's big challenges there in terms of the kinds of access, availability, and affordability challenges that consumers have. We are beginning to understand the impacts of the kinds of food environments that are available for people to make choices on, the larger forces that shape those food environments. And so I think for me, this is a really significant area of investment. Unless we understand the biggest constraints to putting healthy food on people's tables, which are not just what's being produced, right? I mean, those are critical areas of research too. But for us, understanding, the sort of consumer-led possibilities for transformation and investing research resources on that, that's what's going to tell us, how to support mothers to feed their babies more effectively, how to support what happens on school platforms, how to really engage and support consumers around the world in making the healthy choices that we want to see, and to really think then about what are the things that need to change in agricultural supply chains, in value chains, in production systems to support those healthy diets. So we're really thrilled to be actually developing out this program of research as we speak, as one of the CGIAR mega programs, and think it's really important to think about consumer and diet-based research as much as production-based research when we think about the investments that are needed in agricultural research. It's so important for everything sort of from a human-centered perspective.
Yeah, and Henrietta, I'd love to get your take on the critical role of research, running UNICEF, running USAID. How do you see research playing a powerful role in helping to develop better outcomes?
Well, I've been a fan of what we used to affectionately call the CGIARs. And it's very important to have research that allows you to understand both what can be sustainably produced in a locality and also what the nutritional content is for the people who will be ingesting these foods, often cereals. So research is extremely important. And I think, Kate, that it can also be more public and private cooperation. I think we don't emphasize that enough. Peter McPherson and I were just talking about public and private, and I think it's an enormous area that we should really be considering a fertile field. So for instance, soil health, water, these can all be public-private partnerships. Research, no question about it. When I was at the Potato Institute in Peru, I mean, extraordinary numbers of types of potatoes, shapes and colors and nutritional content. So the R&D is definitely there. I recently was in Spain and we were looking at naturally bred genetics that allowed the no mold on fruit. So fruit, the actual berries and grapes, but also on the leaves. No mold meant that you could keep it longer in your home. You can keep it longer in your shop. So many places don't have air conditioning or refrigeration. So public-private partnerships on research in genetics is extremely important. And I think often, we think that the world is known, but the world is not known yet.
Well, that brings me to a question about more data-driven approaches and how those can better enhance the effectiveness of nutrition interventions. So Purnima, could you talk a little bit about how IFPRI's data analysis influences your nutrition strategy?
Yeah, data is very central to what I would call one of the biggest assets we hold at IFPRI, a wide range of assets on not just collecting data, but also on thinking about how data moves along the chain to inform what policymakers and the broader policy community does with it. So I would say data is an essential ingredient. I'd love to see all policy be completely data-based, but often it's more data-informed because the data has to intersect with the other values and priorities that policymakers hold. We have quite a lot of experience across IFPRI in working on these topics. I think for us, some of the big challenges with making data work more effectively to support policies, just how tremendous some of the data gaps are that we're facing. A few years ago, we did work showing how important it was to engage young people around the food system. And then when we tried to understand, what was available there, we found that there was very little data even available on what's going on with young people, how they engage with food, what they eat. And so it becomes really challenging in those situations to engage in sort of data-led transformative actions. But there's many efforts across IFPRI. I'm particularly proud in our nutrition portfolio of some of the work that our teams have been doing, for example, in India for the last 10 years almost, supporting the nutrition policy community there, including UNICEF and other colleagues, as well as the government, on how to look at the data that is available and use that to understand strategic directions for nutrition evidence and policy. Globally, we're making some efforts now together with collaborators around the world on trying to understand how to generate data on nutrition-sensitive social protection. Social protection is a big instrument to support the affordability of healthy diets. Making that nutrition-sensitive delivers additional nutrition gains. But in fact, you don't have all the data you need in this world to understand how those programs are playing out, who they're reaching, who they're not reaching, what the equity gaps are. But these are some of the efforts that we're making to close data gaps. Just going back to the first point that I made earlier, one of the big investments we've made in the last, in the ongoing CGIAR portfolio is actually to strengthen the availability of data on the diets of young people in the countries that we're doing this research in. And, really exciting to see all that we're learning, the kinds of data gaps that we're now beginning to be able to fill. And I know in all of the countries we're working there, our researchers are working hand in hand with partners and policymakers to connect them to this data to help inform strategies. So it's a big, big part of what we do here. And we are, tremendously excited to see you bring attention to it in this conversation. Thank you.
Great. And Henrietta, I'd love to hear your perspective on how to bring youth in to help improve nutrition globally. Obviously, UNICEF working with youth. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, Kate, I think there are two good target audiences. One is youth, and one is young women. They could be mothers, they could be those in their 20s. And it's because we're all changing. So women are now taking more and more jobs outside of the home, so they're going off to work. And so what do they want? They don't want to spend the morning making food. They're just going to grab something quickly and run out the door. And that is true for youth, too. So what we saw at UNICEF was everyone was reaching for snack foods. So if you were in India, as Panima knows, you're going to hop on your motorbike and you're going to just grab something, tuck it into your jacket, and off you go. And so the demand for snack foods and nutritious snack foods and how we can work with the private sector and businesses, micronutrients come into play. But it's understanding the world as it is now and what they need and get ready for it. So young people want to engage on what their diets could be or should be, but often they're going for what tastes good and maybe not what's nutritious or what's sustainable in their food system. So I think when you're talking about data and research, one of the areas is you need to be mapping soils, you need to be mapping sustainable foods, and mapping nutritional ingestion by young people and various sectors of society. If you match those up, artificial intelligence can help us figure out what we need to grow, where, when, for whom, and how it can be quick and appropriate.
As a mother of 2 school-age children, that resonates deeply with me. Well, in our last couple of minutes here, Henrietta, you mentioned the World Bank IMF spring meetings and the message we wanted them to hear. Purnima, I would love to hear what would be your message to the leaders gathering this week around the importance of nutrition?
Look, investment, right? I mean, the leaders that are gathering this week are those who have tremendous power in terms of deploying resources. And I think we've learned so much about, how important an investment in nutrition is, especially in the first 1,000 days. We're also learning so much about how important it is to invest in nutrition across the life course. Again, I just want to come back to the insights from our work with young people and with the Lancet Nutrition series. There, we really, really have to invest in better nutrition of young people. It's for their future, for the future of the planet, for the future of food systems. And so, I think for me, it is really about investing, but alongside investing in action, I think it's really important that leaders across the world understand how important it is to commit to accountability, and what that means is to committing to investments in data and data systems that are going to allow us to see where we move in terms of making progress. And for me, that's key. It isn't enough to just invest in doing something. You have to know whether that something is delivering the outcomes that you expect, to be able to learn fast and really fail fast sometimes. And without those investments in learning and data, we don't know either the successes or the failures. So that's what I'd like to call for, all of our leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. this week. Thanks.
Thank you. Henrietta, what would be your message?
We once had a report that said it's urgent, there's no time to waste, hoping that everyone would realize that wasting, stunting, and obesity really were forms of malnutrition. And so some of it is just education. So my number one would be education in the schools, primary, secondary, everywhere in the world. If young people can be educated as to what is nutritious and how they can grow foods that are ecologically sustainable in their environments, it will change the world. And I'd particularly focus on young women. They can change the diets of their families, of their villages, of their nations, and they will be extraordinary. There is something else, though, that the World Bank can do, which is to focus on water. I think that drought-resistant, nutritious foods that are going to be extremely important, fast-growing. And we are going to have to focus as a world more on drought resistance. We do not have enough river systems that are plentiful in water. And we can see it coming, and it's going to hit us hard. So it means that all the CGIARs and IFPRI and everyone should focus on what we can do as a world to meet the world's needs in food. It's urgent.
Well, thank you, Purnima. Thank you, Henrietta, so much for sharing your insights with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Well, we are going to continue the conversation, and I'd like to invite our panelists to come join me on the stage here. So we have Geeta Sethi, who's advisor and global lead for food systems at World Bank. We have Catherine Megan, associate vice president and general counsel at IFAD. We have Matthias Berninger, who's executive vice president, public affairs, science, sustainability, and HSE at Bayer AG, and Robert Bertram, chief scientist at USAID. Join us. I'm a little far away. I might come join you guys over here. Is that allowed? There we go. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us for this conversation today. And, you know, Geeta, when we were backstage, Henrietta posed a good question around what is it that the nutrition community wants from the World Bank IMF spring meetings this week. We've just heard some messages towards that community, but I'd love to hear from you, your perspective on that.
Thank you. It works now. What a pleasure to be here, and what a great session. I look forward to a very, very interesting next half hour. I think Purnima already alluded to what the world really wants to hear in terms of from the spring meetings, and I want to break it up into two parts. I think the first is there is so much strife, and almost 1 billion people in terms of hunger. So I think one immediate request is to manage this short-term crisis, but not make it just food security, but make it food and nutrition security. And the second is a recognition that actually we are not in the 19th century where growth can only come from fossil fuels, that there is an alternative to energy, and they need support packages that are big enough for countries to be able to finance these needs. So those are sort of the top liners.
Yeah, and I would love to just go a little bit further on, you know, you talk about some of the trade-offs, right? When you're looking at, you want nutritious food, you want sustainable food, you want cost-effective food. How do you think about that in balancing some of those trade-offs in your policies at World Bank?
You're absolutely right. I think that's what we have done. That's what's not been a big challenge. That it's not, the world produces enough food, more food than ever today, but it's come at a very, very high cost. We bankrupted the planet. We are the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. We are driving pandemics by deforestation and ensuring transmission from wild domestic animals to humans. And every second person on this planet today is unhealthy. And so I think a transformation, and you and I have been working very much along those lines, where we really believe that a system that is causing so much strife and can still rely on close to $1 trillion, 800 billion or more of public support, means fundamentally the way we finance food has to change. And so and even today, the big financing is domestic financing in the food system, so many of the countries. So clearly there is a big agenda there in terms of really having a fit-for-purpose domestic financing. But alongside, I want to bring up two things that are very relevant to the nutrition and healthy diets. And Purnima and others spoke about it. Henrietta spoke about the affordability side, is the poverty lines. Today, in large number of countries, the poverty lines are largely caloric sufficient. And so, but to make them nutrition sufficient really means that we need to work hand in hand with the entire income support program, which is globally $1 trillion, but not designed with nutrition sensitivity. So, I mean, if you want people to eat better, they need to be able to reach into their pockets. And so I think the income support programs need to be really revisited in terms of the design. The previous fireside chat also talked about children being the main sort of hostage to this system. And I want to touch a little bit as well on debt for food swaps that you and I have been thinking a lot about, and that the argument here is that there is a permanency argument, which very much now is being accepted again in the margins of the spring meetings with ministers of finance, and because the highly indebted countries are highly food insecure. And the main sort of hostage to food insecurity are children, which means wasting, stunting, permanent human capital loss. So there's a big moral argument why debt for food needs to be also an instrument available to these countries, of course, within a acceptable fiduciary and macro governance setup. But all of this, so it's not just one instrument. I think we just need to put a lens to everything we do, the way we do climate, to really move the needle.
Thank you. And Katie, I'd love to bring you in. And we talked a little bit in the earlier fireside chat with Henrietta about working with schools and mothers. And at IFPRI, you work a lot with local and rural communities. Could you talk a little bit about the role of rural communities in our fight against malnutrition?
Thank you so much. And indeed, IFPRI's role and mission is to eradicate poverty and hunger in rural areas. We all know that about 80% of the extreme poor live in rural areas. So the fact that we're focused on agriculture and food systems there, and that laser focus really has a huge impact on working to try to tackle this. And I think that, as you say, the fact that we have a very community-centered approach is really critical to trying to unlock some of these issues. You know, as you said, it's not just a moral argument. Yes, I think we all agree we should be investing in nutrition for children. It's also an economic argument, because when you're investing in nutrition for children, you're changing the economic prospects and perspectives of the whole next generation. That's an investment we should all be locking arms to make today. And that's the kind of investment that IFPRI makes each day working with rural communities. So giving a zoom-in example, say we're working, for example, on a current project in Nicaragua, which has many, interlocking issues, nutrition being one for children, political issues, lots of migration, fragility, et cetera. You all in this audience know these issues well. I do really want to underline, though, what Henrietta said about nutrition is foundational, and that's something that we really believe. And so there we're working, for example, with the local community and schools to change communications about nutrition, both at the household level and the community level, to really understand and have a culture and mindset change about the importance of investing in nutrition from children and going up, and how that allows communities to make an investment in their future. And we're doing simple things, increasing and integrating nutrition into household planning, working on school gardens and school meals and this type of thing, bringing women, youth, and children into the center of the conversations and empowering them, giving them the agency to act. In terms of finance, I really agree with you. Finance is critical on this. And I think that we have to have a multi-stakeholder engagement. We have to not ignore Indigenous peoples who have already a lot of the secrets that can unlock this. Using opportunity crops, Indigenous crops, which can be more nutritious, which can be more climate resistant, really learning from them. Engaging with the private sector and catalyzing them in to also do this, and then really focusing on the food system as a whole. And I think that this is something that is very important and very key for IFPRI.
Yeah, Mattia, so looking at the private sector and the food system as a whole, food production and food and ag, we mentioned earlier, Gita mentioned there's been a contributor to some of the challenges, but also can provide a lot of the solutions. So at Bayer, how do you think about helping to make food more nutritious, but also more sustainable, more accessible? And how does that fit into your approach to building a stronger food system?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I would add a third component. The food system also suffers quite a lot. So if you compare, let's say, some of the other extractive industries, Climate change is partially caused by the food system, but the foundational players of the food system, especially farmers, and here especially smallholder farmers, suffer a lot from its consequences, be it extreme weather events, droughts that we see in many places, happening more often than anything we've seen in the decades before. So we talked a bit about R&D budgets. The R&D budget of Bayer in the food space is roughly 3 times of the budget of CGIAR. So if you think about that, it's a quite large amount of annual investment. And what we are trying to do is to align all of those 2.5 billion euros that we spend every year along the lines of 3 elements. One is mitigation. How can we make sure that the food system is less dependent on fossil fuels and also emitting less greenhouse gases is number one. The second element is adaptation. How can we make sure the food system is better able to resist climate change? And that is true for both crop losses and the nutritional quality, because one of the big challenges is that rapidly increasing temperatures also affect the nutritional density of most of our foods. And then the third one is access. How can we make sure that these R&D budgets are not focusing on the traditional focus areas, which would be the large and more affluent farmers in countries like the United States, in the European Union? So mitigation, adaptation, and access are the 3 areas we are looking at. And I give you one example, and here also the topic of public-private partnership is already activated. We know that we cannot continue to grow rice the way we grow it today, and it's probably one of the most foundational crops we talk about. We need to transform it from the paddy rice that it is today to more direct seeded rice. The benefits are ample, so you need much less water. That would be an adaptation topic. You also reduce methane emissions. That's clearly a mitigation topic. But you can actually crop more than one crop in a given year, so you can add something to the nutritional mix as well. And if you then focus on smallholders, you really deliver against excess. These examples, and this is only one of many examples. What I want to say is that we have to look at this. We have to look at how can we accelerate that, move out of the kind of experimental phase. How can we really speed up, work together in speeding up? And we talk a lot about money in the just transition. I think we need to add the topic of transfer of knowledge, of IP to the mix. I don't think that money alone will solve the problem. Access to the latest technologies will be extremely helpful. Henrietta talked about the problem of fungal diseases. She said mold on a berry, but it's basically, fundamentally, it's fungal diseases and fungal resistance. I think with the technologies at hand, we can really work on making plants more resistant against fungi, less dependent on chemistry, and therefore avoid food loss in really big margins. That is the kind of stuff we need to think about, and we need to make sure that these innovations get in the hands of farmers faster and independent on where they live.
Thank you. And so a lot of the panelists so far have talked about nutrition as part of the overall food system and all the many components. So at USAID, how do you see nutrition fitting into your overall food systems transformation strategy?
Thanks, Kate, and I appreciate the question, because my first point is that I think we are concluding that food systems approaches are falling short in reaching the most malnourished and the poorest segments of the population. And as Katie said, this highest incidence of extreme poverty and child stunting they're concentrated in rural areas. And these are, ironically, the same smallholder family farm areas that produce 80%, up to 80% of the population that feeds the global south. So within Feed the Future, we are trying to emphasize clear theories of change and robust impact pathways within a food systems approach. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So to begin with, we're focusing on increasing the productivity of diverse, highly nutritious foods that offer a more diverse, better quality diets, vegetables, legumes, eggs, dairy, fish, but very much trying to make these foods more affordable. And also, of course, this is a huge contribution towards addressing micronutrient deficiency, malnutrition, which remains huge and is both rural and urban. But the affordability issue is enormous. My friend Sean Baker always talks about the fact that an egg costs 15 times as much in Niamey as it does in New York. And, you know, this is just intolerable. We're not going to get to where we need to be in terms of quality diets. Now, having said all that, we don't ignore staples. And I want to turn to my IFPRI colleagues, Marie Ruel and Derek Heady, whose work shows how quickly increases in staple prices lead to worse malnutrition incomes in children. Why? Because when staple food prices go up, people eat more staples and they quit eating fish and dairy and eggs, which cost a lot more. So that is, it's both. It's not one or the other. And then I think the really good news here, though, is that in trying to make nutritious, safe diets more affordable, this is a huge win-win for poverty reduction, for driving nutrition gains in the poorest parts of the country, where we want to link those millions of smallholder farm families with the growing demand for diverse, nutritious, higher value, higher cost foods from cities and towns. That's an absolute essential, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. If sub-Saharan Africa imports its vegetables and its meat and dairy and eggs, that's a huge blow to poverty reduction gains and malnutrition, decreasing malnutrition. And finally, I want to just say how important the empowerment of women is in all these efforts. And, you know, particularly in nutrition, but I actually don't agree with that. I think it's essential in our economic growth, poverty reduction strategies as well. So we know that, just as we know that girls' education is a win across all development sectors, women's access to resources, information, including digital, markets, and then their ability to make decisions around those resources is highly linked to achieving our nutrition gains. And by the way, I just want to say, President Banga's beginning words this week spoke about the burden of malnutrition. And basically, you know, if you have 35% of your people stunted, you are not going to be competitive in a global knowledge economy. And so hats off to Geeta and her colleagues, because I know that takes a lot of work to have those messages come up to the top, but I'm really grateful that they did. Thank you.
Thank you. So Geeta, that's a question for you. You know, the challenges of addressing food security and nutrition are very complex, can vary by location. We know it's very important to have locally context-specific interventions, but Matthias also talked about some of the, you know, the knowledge sharing and the broader changes to global systems. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you balance solutions that are very locally focused with also more global system transformation.
Thank you. I think some of the big agendas that we are dealing with need local action, but they have global implications. And it's very much related to food systems. In fact, thank you for recognizing what President Banga said, but where we are still not there 100%, is really putting food systems transition at the same level as energy transition vis-a-vis a lot of the global outcomes. So, but countries are wanting solutions both on adaptation and mitigation to be able to, because they are being affected. You know, we talked about the whole agenda around water. I mean, water insecurity is everybody's problem at the moment. Air pollution. Air pollution is something that even the rich can't escape, because the rich kids and the poor kids are going to the same environment. And suddenly there's a different pressure on governments to address air pollution. And a big driver of air pollution the way we grow food, the runoffs, the nitrous oxide, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think this concept of local action, local or global, I think in some ways is not really relevant, because everybody is looking for anything that works, and yet has a bigger impact. I just want to touch on something else that Matthias raised, which is food loss and waste. The other day we were here as well. We missed you. And we talked about Africa. Africa's food import bill at the moment is 100 billion, 80% of which is around 4 commodities: rice, maize, wheat, and oilseeds. And those are exactly the commodities where Africa does have a comparative advantage. And yet, when you look at the numbers, you talked about local solutions. 40% is being lost and wasted, both. Food insecurity, adaptation gaps, food and nutrition security. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's hitting. I think this is something that addressing losses and waste is really the hidden part of productivity, and so that if there is something that we can ask countries to do and there are local solutions. I mean, yes, we can have refrigerated supply, value chain, and so on and so forth. Great, but there are other ways also of doing it. So let me stop there.
Thank you. And Katie, I want to bring you back to investments in rural entrepreneurs and rural farmers, and what is needed to really build resilience. I've talked about, obviously, climate is really impacting farmers in a significant way. We have conflict and other challenges. What is it that they really need investment in right now?
Thank you. I think it is, I'm thinking about the global with the local, and things are very intertwined. Like nutrition is so intertwined with poverty, with hunger, with equity, with so many things. At the G20 Alliance for Global Hunger, Against Hunger and Poverty Task Force this morning, investment in rural agriculture was a big theme of the discussion. And I think that this is something that really needs to have a spotlight shone on it. When you look at investments in various sectors, education, infrastructure, manufacturing, et cetera, research shows that investment in agriculture can have 2 to 3 times the impact on eradicating hunger than investment in any other sector. And that's a really powerful statistic. And yet at the same time, you might wonder, why aren't we investing as a global community on the local level in agriculture so much when it's so clear what the impact is? And I think that, one thing is that there's not sadly enough money out there to finance everything, right? When you look at the numbers, 300 billion to 400 billion would be needed annually up to 2030 to make food systems more inclusive and resilient and sustainable. But yet, investment in agriculture is critical. It's important to, yes, address humanitarian needs, that's critical, but investing in agriculture is what gives you a sustainable long-term solution, so you don't have to keep investing in humanitarian each time. Some research indicates that an investment of $1 today in long-term agriculture, similar to what IFPRI does, can save up to $10 in humanitarian aid tomorrow. And so it makes moral sense to support communities, but it also makes economic sense long term. And I think that these are the type of messages we need to continue working on with a people-centered approach, like what IFPRI does. And I wanted to mention just one other project, which brings us back to nutrition, because I think it's important to have food diversification. As you mentioned, Rob, not over-diversification, but diversification, because the staples are still important. But also having impact on nutrition education, because when you're working at the community level, it's important to have the investment, and alongside it, it's equally important to have education about the importance of nutritious food. So just very quickly, we had a project in Chad where more than 27,000 individual people have improved their cooking, nutrition, and hygiene practices at home after participating in a nutrition awareness part of the project. So we helped build agricultural sustainability, agri-value chains, et cetera, and alongside that had nutrition awareness and training, which then has a really beautiful ripple effect across communities and across countries.
Oh, I want to follow on that education component, Matthias. And when we think about transforming food systems, there's sometimes debate over, does the responsibility lie with supply or demand, the producers or consumers? And I want to hear how Bayer works to educate your consumers to encourage more nutritious, sustainable food consumption.
We are basically a business that has three distinct areas we operate in. One is agriculture, one is the consumer health space, and the third is classic pharmaceuticals. And we work a lot in the micronutrient space. I think it's pretty clear that the micronutrient challenges are huge, and they've gotten bigger since the pandemic because, as you said, Robert, food inflation is the natural enemy of a balanced diet. Yeah? And food inflation, for me, is probably the better way to talk about the challenges of the food system than just talking about hunger, because hunger seems to be very far away. Food inflation is a topic that, I mean, if there's a 30% food inflation, the political system, like in the United States, gets really nervous. Think about a country, Lebanon, that has a more than 1,000% food inflation in local currency compared to 2019. I think it's relatively calm for a challenge like that. But going back to your question, we are very much focusing on women here, and on women who are either getting pregnant or who are with young children, because that's an area where we know the deficits, and we can close them. And what we've done is we looked at both the area that micronutrients can do with partners like Vitamin Angels, but also how can we improve the variety of crops being grown in a farm. The good news is that if you ask a smallholder farmer, she already understands that it doesn't make sense to only focus on one crop. If you have 1 or 2 acres, she already diversifies. And to educate how that works best is something we spend a lot of time on in villages. We call that Better Life Farming centers. Smallholder farming, we often talk about it as a problem. We as a company have said, oh, part of our sustainability ambition should be to reach 100 million smallholder farmers. We are actually ahead of our target. The reason being that investing in smallholder farmers is actually good business. When you look at the P&L, and that was the huge surprise for our business, investing in those communities, investing in those women who run those farms, and I'm saying women because it's a majority of women who run smallholder farms in the world, is a really good business. And that's the other message. It's not just what we can do for them, it's also the other way around, to see the economic potential that lies in investing those farms. My favorite book about Africa is one written by Joe Studwell, who wrote a book called How Asia Works. And the nutshell of the book is this: if you focus on family farms, you will lay the foundation for a prospering economy. And wherever I go in Africa, that insight for me is the most forming insight that I see. So How Asia Works, probably the one book you and we all should follow when we look at Africa.
Thank you for adding to my reading list there. Rob, so I want to talk a little bit about building in resilience into systems. Obviously, farmers are frontline and feeling a lot of impact from climate. Henrietta talked about drought and water issues and the importance of building drought-resistant crops. How do you think about resilience integrating into your overall strategy at USAID?
There we go. Thanks, Kate. So we've talked about diversification, which, by the way, is partly dependent on staple yields. A lot of our work in Africa is about trying to get maize yields to the point where people will put more of their land into legumes and vegetables and tree crops and other things that'll make them more money and also provide better nutrition. But if you think about that diversification, that is in itself a source of resilience, and climate resilience in particular. It's also a source of sustainability in the system, the rotations and such that are involved, the management of different kinds of crops and livestock and fish, and of course, income, as I mentioned. It's also much more knowledge intensive, but you know, knowledge is a source of resilience. And the digital tools are providing farmers with information about weather, pests, diseases, prices in the markets, all these things that enable better decision making. Huge source of resilience. And we see this happening in very virtuous ways. In Zambia, for example, in the last decade, 200,000 smallholders have moved out of cereal production into full horticultural production, vegetables and fruits. And where is that going? It's going to cities and towns in Zambia for the most part. So we know that's a positive impact on diets, but they're also becoming a lot less poor. And there's a whole ecosystem of businesses that are growing up, which provides resilience, right? In terms of having markets. Markets in and of themselves are great sources of resilience. We know that. So seeing that penetration, and roads and grid matter. Thank God for cell phones. You know, we've been able to leapfrog in a lot of ways in the information space. I don't want to forget rain-fed systems for resilience. And Henrietta mentioned it. I think others have mentioned the issue of water. 95% of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa staples come from rain-fed systems. We need to do a better job there. And there's a diversification piece built in there too, including the integration of trees and shrubs and other kinds of crops and livestock. I want to also bring it back to nutrition in as much as we really try to be convergent. 15 of our 20 Feed the Future focus countries are also nutrition focus countries. So we're really working to, knowing that nutrition is inherently multi-sectoral. It's not all about food, water and sanitation, women's empowerment, all these things matter. So coming together in ways that we're really looking to optimize that. I do want to mention the vision for adapted crops and soils. I think VAX is something many of you have heard of. And you talked about resilience there. So the soil health dimension, there's a below ground part of VAX and an above ground. That is very much about resilience and climate resilience, because healthy soils hold more water, they sequester more carbon, they provide more opportunities for nutrient cycling and fertilizer and water use efficiency gains of all kinds. And then above ground, the divergence part, taking a second look at some crops that maybe have been passed over, and we've got new tools and new ways to do things in a year or two that used to take 10 years, if you could do them at all. And then I'm almost done. I also wanted to flag a few other things. Bringing back the gender piece, we are working on the minimum dietary diversity index for women. You know, we talk a lot about empowering women. How about getting rid of iron deficiency anemia as a great place to start? You know, it's fundamental. And then also, hearkening back to the multi-sectoral dimension, some of you remember in 2014, we brought out the U.S. multi-sector nutrition strategy. Well, our new chief nutritionist and our crack team in USAID are working across the government to update that strategy now, a new multi-sector nutrition strategy. And we're grateful that that had a lot of influence. And finally, just to double down on markets, on things like fortification, new opportunities there with the private sector, complementary foods, a huge thing that women want. And we need to really leverage industrial level food processing to try to get at some of these things. So I guess we're taking a pretty comprehensive approach, Kate.
Great, thank you. Well, we have someone in the audience that I would love to bring in their perspective. Maybe we can have mic over to Joyce Canabo, who's the Professor of Human Nutrition at Sequoia University of Agriculture. So Joyce, you're here this week from Tanzania. I'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections on what the panelists spoke about today.
Thank you. And thank you, panelists, for very excellent presentations. Really moved, and I thought we are really heading towards something. My perspectives regarding this topic, I would say transformation of food systems for improved nutrition. Currently, there's no common understanding of what is supposed to be done. We are really trying to get there, but we are still not very sure. And actually to identify which component of the food system that needs to be transformed in order to improve nutrition, because there are quite a number of dots and pins and nuts and bolts to be dealt with, and so far we are still working on that. And again, I think transformation should be driven by demand from the consumer perspective, and so that we know exactly what kind of malnutrition will be dealt with by what kind of system or pathway in the transformation system. And that's why we say, okay, do we need to reverse the food value chain? Instead of starting from production, we start from what is needed and then walk back to see what crops can be able to provide us with those kind of nutrients. And then the pathways in food transformation, they're just too complicated. I don't know how we can be able to communicate the various pathways that we see in the food system transformation for improved nutrition, to be able to people to understand what we are talking about, because these things are discussed at much higher level, and the people who are really who need that information are not aware of what is happening. So in most cases, and I mentioned that I'm a community person, in the community people just know about the continuum activities that they do, and that's what they call life. So if we go there with the complicated pathways, I don't think we'll be able to make a difference there. Another issue is about the human element in the food system transformation. Sometimes we talk about food system as if it's something far-fetched or somewhere there, and we forget about our actions in the food system itself. What have we done to the food system? Because transformation has been done before, is being done now. What has been our actions in the transformation process? At some point, I think we have caused more harm to the food system than the system causing harm to us. So I think it's very important that we consider our actions in the food systems, decisions, desire in terms of food. What do we want? What do we demand in terms of food, so that we are able to really make sure the transformation is appropriate? So basically, I would imagine that it's not a question of understanding the food system, but understanding our actions in the food system and how we can be able to really make the food system work. Again, the focus on vegetables and fruits, I think, is gaining traction everywhere. The Zambia example is very good. And it's good for resilience, it's good for climate change, because these are plants. And obviously, they will help us with the carbon sequestration and all that. So I think also the contribution to micronutrient intake. And you know, with low energy or high energy diet, so long as you have micronutrients, the food will be utilized, but not to that extent when you are deficient of micronutrient. And then I see what a very strange thing here is about the high costs of these foods, fruits and vegetables. Because if you consider ultra-processed foods, these are much cheaper compared to less processed foods. Because vegetables and fruits are not processed. You pick, you consume, and that's it. But the ultra-processed have to go through a long process, and the cost is not that high. So should we have a policy like for each dollar of spent on ultra-processed food, 20% should go to producing vegetables and fruits? So that I think this corporate responsibility of the people who are processing ultra-processed foods can also contribute to that. My last point, linkages. Food systems are interlinked, okay? It's global, it's regional, it's country or national, it's individual, even household. So the discussion about transformation should also take into consideration of the interlinkages, because systems depend on each other. I think it was mentioned here. So the issue of talking about low or middle income countries and high income countries and all that, when it comes to food, it's food and everybody needs all the 42 nutrients that we need per day. And therefore, we need actually to be holistic in the way we discuss some of these things. And I think that's all what I have. But just to focus on the investment research. Research and data generation is not something that is very attractive and in terms of investment. So I don't know what World Bank is thinking about really enabling countries to generate data through research or otherwise. And the AI thing, I think, is something that is coming up, which could actually be very, very useful. But again, it's knowledge sharing. Very critical. In the transformation, we need knowledge sharing. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to really move ahead. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
for
Joyce.
the
I am going to also bring in Tambra Stevenson, founder and CEO of Wanda, to pose a question to the panel. And then I'm going to look to my team here and see if we have time for any other audience questions, or we might need to wrap up. Okay, so why don't you go ahead, and then we'll invite a couple more questions from the audience.
First, I wanted just to open up and share Wanda's Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture that I started 8 years ago at a time when World Bank had the Invest in Nutrition initiative. And I want to just share the opening words that resonated with me that Keith Hansen, at the time VP of Human Development, said that when we invest in nutrition, it's not just a philanthropic act, but it actually has business model opportunities in creating double-digit growth. Having an economist say that to a nutritionist was powerful for me, because as the point that Robert just made, nutrition is multisectorial. And now as the co-chair for Nutrition Security and Economic Development at our Tufts Food and Nutrition Innovation Council, we're making the business case that when we invest in nutrition, invest in women and girls, we truly do nourish the world. And you help build better economies and societies and productive households, classrooms, and really workplaces when you do that. And we lay as the central figure as women and girls when we understand that. And that's why at Wanda we've invested in nutrition education and agriculture education in Kano, Nigeria, at Barrow University, and 25 young women starting their career paths in college education in ag and nutrition, because it's not enough to provide healthy food access or just educate them at the consumer level or classroom level, but actually understand that it's a career path. And once she, as an educated woman, as I am now a mom who's been an extension agent, invest in her career path, she will have that double, triple digit growth, because she will invest in herself, her family, and ultimately she'll be the food hero that our community needs. And so with that, I wanted to just open up to the panel about the importance of food democracy, about everyone having a seat at the table and being a food citizen, and understanding that it's not enough to understand that we are foodies, but we must be food citizens at a time in this country and really around the world. This is the most elections happening, and how important it is to put food on the ballot for political candidates locally, nationally, and globally to know where they stand in making these investments in nutrition and investments in gender equity, which basically is nutrition security. I want to open up with this phrase and have you comment on it. A poorly nourished community cannot effectively organize, but once fed well, we can begin to envision and build a more just society. I made that quote in a Milken piece last year around food democracy, but I wanted to open up because UN Declaration of Human Rights speaks of right to food. We understand right to health with universal healthcare coverage, but having food now integrated in that, when we see the food as medicine take off here in the US, how can this idea of right to food be synonymous to right to health? And how do we make sure that that's a part of fighting for everyone as a food democracy around the world?
That's an excellent question. And while I see who wants to volunteer to tackle that, we can take maybe a couple questions from the audience if you want to line up behind either of these microphones. But who wants to tackle the food democracy? Rob?
I want to thank both the questioners. Joyce, thank you for saying, what do we mean by transformation? That word is so overused or so much used without being precise. And I guess my big point in listening to you was things have to be locally led. There have to be people, if you're going to end up being demand driven, you have to know people who know where the people who are making the decisions have to know where the demand is and what people want. And then I guess, Tamara, the other thing I wanted to just say to you, you brought up investing in people. And I think that's often a harder thing to do when you're in a place like AID because it's longer term and more diffuse perhaps, but wow, if you multiply what you talked about with that woman who doubles and triples her income and all the benefits that brings to her community. So I guess the democratization approach, I guess to the extent that we can be bottom up is the way to get at that. And just while I've got the mic, Kate, I just want to say, I mentioned VAX, the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, and I didn't mention our fabulous partners, IFAD, FAO, the Africa Union, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And I just want to call out the fact that, but it's at the end of the day, it's going to be about African leadership, and we're working to ensure that. Sorry to go on.
Well, thank you, Rob. Why don't we take the couple questions we have here, and then we'll let the panelists respond to all of the questions at once. So go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joanna Veltri from IFAD. I hope you'll forgive me for asking what is sometimes a bit of a tough question, but as part of this, one thing we haven't touched on is the sort of sometimes feuding polemics between, say, the agroecology folks over here and this, pure science and belief in GMOs over here. To me, without taking a side there, as my institution doesn't, I will say that one of the things that is problematic about that is that divide. And so I really liked the phrasing of food democracy. How do we get to a point where we sort of listen to the folks on the other side, whatever side we happen to be on, try to diminish that gap by creating, I wrote it down here, so pardon me, an informed food democracy with trust in public and private institutions. And Matthias, I'm particularly curious about your answer to this one.
Great, thank you. And then we'll take the other question.
Hi, thank you very much. Michael Gabriel with WHH, the German NGO Welthungerhilfe. Thank you very much for the conversation today. It's so interesting. Simple question, really. I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about today is a kind of like best practices for how we can and should be working in a stable situation, and yet the world is increasingly fragile and VUCA. And so maybe my question is a little more directed towards Dr. Gita, because I know that the World Bank just organized a few months ago a very interesting summit on working in fragility, conflict, and violent situations. So how would we also take some of your thoughts on working in places that are a lot more fragile and violent? and unstable. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Matthias, do you want to tackle the first question?
Yeah, happy to. So while I'm happy that, for example, a country like China, the People's Republic in this case, has fully opened up to biotechnology as late as last year, or Nigeria has done so this January, you haven't heard me moving in this kind of controversy, because actually I'm tired by it. So I spent my whole career, be it as a politician, be it in business, in this constant fight. I think the food community has weakened itself in that fight. And it's not about an or, it's about an end. We are looking at soil health and cover crops, and guess what? In the organic farm space, you have a lot of innovative ideas combined with our understanding of the genetics, our ability to kind of leverage that. We can create literally wonders. So in the United States, we will introduce a cover crop that is basically a classic organic cover crop that will turn into a crash crop for US farmers. And that's kind of like ticking all the boxes. It's, from a business perspective, attractive, but it has the benefits that you normally see in organic farms who cannot or do not want to work with artificial fertilizers, because there's a huge ability to bring nitrogen into the air to mobilize natural ways to do that. So the less we kind of point fingers at each other, the better. And the more we understand that we need to mobilize more R&D. So it's not about whether we have private or public investment. We just need more of it. That's another either or question we can change. And that's how I look at it. And from a democracy perspective, I like the question. For me, it's about the 500 million smallholder farmers in the world that are not part of these meetings. So when I talk about democracy, is how do we bring them and often those women into this conversation is really crucial. That's also why we invest a lot in bringing these smallholder farmers all the way to even to the Vatican, to have a conversation with the Papal Academy of Sciences, because I feel we talk a lot about them, but we don't give them an ability to talk about their realities. And guess what? They are looking, they don't look at one or the other solution. They are open for like a whole variety, and opening that floor is really crucial in my book.
Thank you. And Gita, do you want to address the second question around fragility?
Sure, happy to. But before I do that, I just want to go back on the human rights, the food rights. That food is a human right, because we've been speaking to some of the lawyers about this, particularly in our Debt for Food agenda, that if it has ever been tested in courts of law, national laws or international laws or even local laws. So it's definitely something that we have our finger on that pulse. On the fragility story, I think you're absolutely right. So out of brevity, let me make simple but absolute statements. Fragility to a large extent is really a governance failure in our country. And the hunger and anger is fueled. So I think the question for us in many of these countries has also been, and remember the World Bank's Memorandum of Understanding is with the government. But if the government is the driver of fragility and insecurity, then how does one work around it? And the mechanism that we've been trying to, and yet one can't do, as Katie was saying, you cannot just go into crisis by crisis management through humanitarian. I mean, of course, that's needed immediately, but how do you build systems up? So a big area that is obviously agriculture in terms of investments. And then the question is, how does one work, I don't want to use the word bypass, but how does one work despite a failure, a governance failure? And there, the mechanism is really about community-based development, is really looking at the shortest path in terms of the money being able to flow into these communities with some kind of checks and balances, because they are really guerrillas by night and farmers by day to a large extent. And yet they've lost trust. So how does one have a system that they trust? It's not easy, but we've been able to do that in some of the countries. And in some cases, for example, Nepal has been a success story where we were able to break the trap of fragility and conflict. Others is an ongoing strife.
Thank you. And Katie, I'm going to let you have a quick final word, and then we will need to wrap our panel, but we will have questions. Well, we can, maybe afterwards when we have the lunch, then we can circulate, because we are running tight on time, but thank you. But Katie, why don't you give your final words here?
Yeah, just to add on the fragility question, which I think is really excellent. You know, IFADS has about 30% of our projects in fragile contexts, and there's not one answer. I would say, though, when you're working with local communities and you really have a stay and deliver mission as we do, it is surprising to me how often, despite the fragility, the projects are able to continue, because as you said, this is critical to the communities to have this agriculture to build the future. And one quick example, in Sudan, for example, we have 9 current projects there. You're all seeing what's happening in the papers. 7 of them are moving along just fine. And that was surprising to me to get that briefing recently. Doesn't mean it's like that in every context, but it's important to be there, be engaged with the communities, and be community-led. Because if the communities see the value of this, despite fragility, conflict, which feed each other, they're really pushed to do the best to continue.
Well, thank you. And hopefully some of our panelists can stay for our networking lunch after this in case you want to come up and talk to them further about any of this. But I'd like to say thank you so much to Gita, Katie, Matthias, and Rob for sharing your insights and your time with us today. Let's give them a round of applause. Next, I'm going to invite to the stage Johan Swinnen, who's the Director General at IFPRI and Managing Director of Systems Transformation at CGIAR, for some closing remarks. Johan, over to you. Here, I can hand you a mic. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon in the meantime. We've run a bit over time. I'm actually standing between you and better nutrition, I guess, which is waiting behind the wall here. Just take this one here. Okay. I should also say that we talked about climate change. Actually, climate change had an impact on the agenda here on the panel, because Ismahani Aluafu, who is the Executive Managing Director of the CGIAR, was supposed to be here. She was stuck in the flood in Dubai, and she will be here any minute now, but she's been arriving with a day and a half as a delay. But I'm happy that she still make it, and there'll be a chance for you to interact with her. I'm not going to try to come up with a summary or key points. There's been so many different things. Let me just add just a few issues. I'm going to keep it very short. One is that what we discussed, it was a huge issue. Okay, it's a huge issue in terms of the number of people who are affected, the way it's affecting their lives, the challenges that we face, and the investments that are needed. That came true, I think, from many of the speakers. The second one is that nutrition, healthy diets, and inclusion are very strongly interrelated. It's the poorest people in the world who are suffering the most, and the weakest people in the world, the less enforced, less empowered, who are suffering the most from healthy diets. And at the same time, it also works the other way around. The fact that they have poor diets is leading to disempowerment, is leading to poverty, etc. And you can link this also to elements of course, the gender issue is very important. Child malnutrition is huge. We know it's having a huge impact on the rest of their lives, their empowerments, access to labor markets, etc. I was right. Any minute, and any minute was, it was any second, actually, so. I think on the other points, I say what we've heard a lot is and. Okay, we need local and global approaches. We need mitigation and adaptation. We need to look at the whole value chain, the whole food systems perspective. We can't just look at only the consumer or only the producer, only the food businesses. We need innovations in technology, in management, in institutions and policy. We need all of this. I think also if we have to address both at the consumption side and at the production side, we have to deal with information education, as it was emphasized, but also basically providing access, looking at the financing means of people, risk. Okay, a lot of the technologies that are there are not used, and also some of the consumption patterns are not there because it's just too risky for these households. We need private and public. Ismahani, our colleague from Bayer, just said that they have a $2.5 billion R&D. So this is our new target for the CGIAR to go for. In terms of, I think, finance, Gita made the point, I think is really important. We need more finance. Remember, Purnima referred to investment, but we need also to do much better with the finance that is there right now. So we're spending $800 billion on public subsidies to agriculture broadly, and we can do much better on that. It's not giving the right incentives, nor at the production, nor at the consumption side. I think also an important point which came through several times, which was on the moral rights or the human rights, moral issues and economics. And several people emphasized they go together. They're not trade-offs. They're actually win-wins. They reinforce each other. And then on the last point, I have on our own organization, IFPRI and CGIAR, it's clear we have a lot to do. There's also a lot of endorsement, I think, from the people who spoke today. I should mention one thing, which I don't think anybody mentioned, which is our work on biofortification. I think it's played a really important role, both in terms of the work that Harvest Plus has done, that SIP has done, and I think it's important to recognize that. On the policy work, I see Alamayu is in the audience. He's our head of our Ethiopia program, and this is just an example where I think the policy work has contributed really to a much better nutrition policies, nutrition-sensitive set of policies in Ethiopia and in several other countries as well. And then the final point is, this is advertising. We have an annual global food policy report, and this year this will be about nutrition, healthy diets, and it's going to be launched in this room in a month and a week or something on 29th of May, and you're all very much welcome to be here again. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Johan, and thank you to all of you who joined us this afternoon and joined us online. Big thank you to CGIAR and IFPRI for partnering with us on this important discussion today. And again, thank you to all of our panelists and contributors. We can now break for that lunch, that nutrition that Johan just talked about. So thank you all very much.